Oha, Haumataki. Okay, Elijah Hopkins Demie. My name is Elijah Hopkins, and welcome to the Land-Based Learning Project podcast series. Again, I'm with Tahashi, Mr. Jeremy Red Eagle. I shared a little bit about, I think last week we talked about artwork and land and all this stuff, and then we talked about harvesting medicinal plants and edible foods, things of that nature. And so I think today we're going to continue that discussion on different things related to that. So, Tahashi, kind of maybe jog my memory here. I don't remember exactly where we left off, but I know there were some key points that you thought were important, and we'll just kind of let the conversation go wherever it goes.
Yeah, I think we were talking about art and different culturally relevant art connected to the land, how it was connected to the land. And so I think we were starting to head into the direction of talking about harvest, like when the different materials that our people have always used in different aspects of art, I guess you could say. So for me, personally, I was thinking of like when I first got into this stuff, crafting, making things. It was actually through the International Traditional Game Society. And I started, working with youth, teaching them our traditional games. But part of that is crafting and making the implements for those games. And so that's kind of was my introduction to it was willow, like chohuanjicha, like how to uh, proper ways of harvesting the willow and the different kinds of willow and when to harvest it and different things that you can do with it so that we're, as Dakota people, I think we're always trying to utilize all the things that we harvest and doing it in the right way. So one thing I learned, like with willow, you go out and it usually, of course, grows by water. Put tobacco down or whatever offerings that you're taught, and we would harvest these and we would use for different things like my wife teaches like Tawi Kapsiche, the women's double ball game. And so like the sticks would be made out of willow. And so we could take the lower part of the thicker part of the willow branch and we would cut it and utilize that to make the stick. We could when it's in the springtime when the sap is running, it's easy to peel the bark off of it. And then you could take that bark and you could roll it up into a ball and make a ball out of it. And then you can take the top parts of that willow and you can make different, hoops or different things for other items, other stuff. But then I learned that you could also take the tops of those willows and stick it back into the soil and it'll grow roots and it'll grow again. So just that, indigenous knowledge, I guess, of, how our people, they had that intimate relationship with the land. And so I just try to keep those things in mind when I go out to harvest different stuff for the different things that I do is like how not only am how I am as an individual going to benefit from this, but how is the land going to benefit from it? So that's something that, and this is not like knowledge that, I or anybody else knows all these things. It's stuff that we learn as we're reconnecting to this and trying to figure this stuff out. And, of course, a lot of our elders may retain a lot of this knowledge, and then some of it we have to refigure out. But bow and arrows, I know you have experience with that, going out and harvesting. What does that look like? The different types of wood. You have to be able to identify different trees, sehti chan, the ash, or whatever type of wood you're going to use to make a bow. And then usually our harvest times are in the winter when it's cold and the sap is down. So then you have to be able to identify those trees without their leaves. Arrowwood, the champahu or choke cherry. So I don't know how it is out here. It's been a while since I've harvested choke cherries out here in Montana, but back in Siston, it's they're starting to become very few. Wanid I, they say. They're starting to disappear because of the agriculture. But the ones that still exist, the chokecherry bushes, you go out and they're starting to be overtaken with like different kinds of fungus and different stuff that, kind of is killing them off. So when I go out and I harvest my arrow shafts, I think about that. And so I look at the plant and then I will find, where those funguses or different things are, um, and cut those out, So I take responsibility at as I'm taking from this plant something for my benefit, what can I do to help it at the same time so it's sustainable and it'll be there for, generations to come. But I just think that when you're out there on the land, when you're utilizing these materials, you're just gaining more intimate knowledge of whether it's the plants, the dirt, because we have earth paints that come from the soil, animals, things from hunting, the hides, the bones, the horns, antlers, sinew, all of that stuff, So these things come from the land, and hunting, prime example, as we're butchering, as we're, most people that have any experience with hunting, they know how to butcher an animal. But a lot of the deeper knowledge of like the different parts, the different things that you can utilize, that knowledge isn't is common anymore. So we're just learning those things as we go about. Different techniques of using a lot of these natural materials is crucial. Yeah, I think so. That's where we were. That's where we were headed.
Yeah, I remember that. And then we're also, you had me thinking there's, just from my own experience, a few years back, Tashi Tanner, he went and showed me some of the secret spots around Sisseton for Sinkpe Tawote. But he was telling me about the backstory about that area, and they say it used to grow around here too. Um, but I believe some of these things could probably be reintroduced and we take care of them. But I think on the extreme end, there's a destructive side to, I think, agricultural farming and westward expansion, especially on some of these grasslands and some of these areas where traditional plants and herbs and medicines they grew. And so for that, the example around Sisseton area, I know a lot of that Sinkpe Tawote, it was just destroyed, and then part of it was, I think, probably intentional, uh, because they viewed that some of those areas just as prime farmland. But there's also been an element where people that are attempting to utilize the medicines have complete disregard. They found little groves of Sinkpe Tawote medicines that we use. They just rip it out of the ground and it's not sustainable. There's a way you can harvest by clipping the root system and leaving I forget the scientific term for it, but there's the rhizome. Yeah, the rhizome. And then it'll regenerate. That's the kind of the beauty of some of those medicines. And in fact, I even took part of the rhizome, just a small piece. I took it back here to Fort Beck and we replanted it. So I can't tell anybody where my secret stash is, but it's there. So I know it's possible because we're learning. And then having that experience, so now I know how to share that with my kids, and I can remember that experience. But that was just through relationships, people being willing to share things. So you have to, if someone does take you to their spots, just kind of be aware of that and respect that, I guess, that transmission of knowledge. So, but I think you can apply that type of scenario with dang near any type of plant harvesting. Understand the plant, when to harvest. And so I know you touched on that a little bit, but some of them are specific to certain times of the year. Like when the June berries are ready, might not be when Sinkpe Tawote is ready, or Tipsina. They'll have their cycles and whatnot. So it all depends. Usually your fruits come out at a different time, but some of those herbs that are used for medicines, September, October is my understanding. And then even for practical uses for like woods, like I would imagine for lacrosse sticks, or definitely with a tazipe, bow wood. They say, like in the winter times probably better. I would imagine there's like maybe a spiritual reason, but I think there's like practical reasons, because there's sap or water in the wood and it'll just get a little more brittle and break. So some of those things, it took me like a long time to understand that, maybe because I didn't care when I was younger, but like as I've gotten older, when you start to take an interest into harvesting, learning your culture, wanting to make your own bow, those things have to be taken into consideration. Otherwise, you're just going to continue to make mistakes or the wood's going to break. And I think my experience just developing a pretty intimate relationship with the land. So a lot of when I drive around, I find myself looking at, oh, that looks like a good spot for some choke cherry, some arrow shoots or different things, So it definitely connects you to the land and every geographical region. There's different things that are people probably Hana Wanangash probably traveled just to get those things, kind of makes you think. So, um,
Yeah,
I,
I think that there's I believe personally that there's spiritual and logical things attached to all of the stuff that we do. And how those things are intertwined or connected, I don't fully comprehend that, but I do believe that it's a thing. Just like with Chanshasha. And they always, and you'll hear different things, but they'll say, this is the time, winter time, that's when you harvest Chanshasha for the tobacco, right? But then visiting with Dekshi Dickie Moves Camp, he was explaining to me when and how and why we harvest the chinchasha in the wintertime. But then he also gave the logical explanation that when it's not done in that proper time and there is the sap, starting to come into the willows, like say if it's after, getting around springtime. He says when you go to um cut that though, you how you process the chanchasha and you go to like cut it, and to make it finer, that if it if it jumps, he says then it's not going to be no good for your pipe, and then it can clog your pipe and all of these other things, so that's more of a logical explanation as well as the spiritual that they talk about. So yeah, I think that when you're out there on the land and you're doing these things, you're learning, you're becoming, you're starting to have an intimate relationship with how these things impact each other. Our harvesting practices and the medicines is a big one, because today we're in a day and age where this is what people are wanting to reconnect with, which is good. We want our people to reconnect with our traditional, medicines, foods, art practices, whatever it is that they're doing, ceremonial reasons. But how, what, when, where, why, all of those things are relevant to that. And how is it impacting? Because if you're not knowledgeable on when to harvest Timsina, especially in a place like Sisseton, where we are checkerboard reservation, like that's going to impact us, because then those things will, if they're not, sustainable, if they're not coming back every year, and you're having more and more people return to these ways and harvesting these things, and at the same time, our land base seems to be getting smaller and smaller every year because of agriculture, because of development, because of all of these things going on. What's that stuff going to look like in 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now? And so by doing these things, if we're doing it with the right intention, we're actually going to educate ourselves, and we're going to realize how much of our land is not healthy today. So what are the things that we can do to sustain that land and to make sure that it's healthy, and that these plants and these medicines will always be here for us?
one thing, I think it's important for people to consider, think about, um, some of these plants and herbs. If you're going to ingest them, if they're going to use them for food or for medicinal purpose, I highly recommend you find a mentor, someone to connect you. If it's going to be something where you're making a bow, arrow, even then, try and find a mentor at all possible. Some of these things maybe you could kind of experiment with and kind of learn yourself. Okay, but the things that you're going to ingest, I highly recommend you find somebody, because it can be dangerous, really. For example, I remember I was trying to harvest some chayaka, some like wild mint, and because I was excited. Oh, it's everywhere. You listen to people, all right. So I remember going out a few different times, really loaded up my bag, was in a good way. I thought I made a good score. But some of these plants, they have lookalikes. And people had told me that, when I was younger and read different things, but it's true. Because I remember I put some of that in my mouth. Because some of it, I think I mixed up. Some of it, you could smell the mint. Some of it, made my mouth really like kind of bitter and started to kind of tingle in a weird. I was like, what? Here, I think it's kind of poisonous to be honest, but I don't. Your body will automatically recognize that. Um, but I don't know. There's a lot I don't know about plants and herbs. Tansha, I remember you saying uh Kushi Black Thunder from Sistine. I remember specifically remembering you telling me like a few years back how she was talking about how, you know, some of that stuff can like literally kill you. You know, some of
Yeah.
those medicines are really so maybe if you could share a little bit about that, that would be helpful. I think just for people to have perspective. I mean, you don't have to share all the goods, man, but like some of that stuff would be helpful.
Yeah, I remember I was asking her. I would one thing I did with those elders in Sitchin was, plants. And my main thing, like, of course, I wanted like some knowledge of the plants, but really I was focused more on the names, and a lot of like maybe knowledge that's starting to disappear. Not so much the common ones that a lot of people know. And so I focused on that for a long time. So, anyways, I would sit there and have conversation with her because people would tell me, "Oh, she knows a lot about that stuff." But the first thing is she told me was Dakota ekta pejuta ghenashkat pichashni, in our Dakota way that those medicines you can't play with them. And I think that she was laying a foundation, before we would have these conversations about this stuff that I understood and knew that she would probably be selective with the information she would share with me. But yeah, I think that that's real, and I think that today, like it's kind of I have a you know different opinions on like today because of social media, right? A lot of stuff gets shared on social media, and part of it is really good, part of it not so much. And I think that as we're relearning and reconnecting with these things, there are plants that was just common knowledge for people back in the day because that was how we lived. And so, willow bark is like an aspirin, right? Or quaking aspen leaves are the same, makeup that aspirin has. And so you could take that for headache or whatever. But and even those, I don't want to call them simple or basic or common plants, even those you have to be careful with. But then there's other medicines that were more in depth, and I just think that those are things that we have to be careful of today. And it's like we're in a place where we want so badly to reconnect with all these things that we just want to learn and know all of it. And that's not really realistic. I think that there were certain people that had certain responsibilities a long time ago. And a big one that Kunshi Phyllis would always tell me is that these are, that was the women's responsibility. They were the ones that had that intimate relationship with the plants and with the medicines because of, women naturally are life givers. And so I always think about that, to be mindful and careful of those things. But like I remember Dexy Glenn, we were talking about chahutkato, the echinacea, and he would say they use that. There's a lot of uses for it, but a big one was for toothache. And then he would say, Ota iachuki he ubedechikte, like if you take too much of it, even though it'll help, with a toothache, but if you take too much, all of your teeth are going to break up and fall out, you know, and I don't know if that's true or not. I don't, maybe it was a teaching that they would say to prevent people from abusing it or not, over harvesting it or something. I have no idea, or maybe it's true. Maybe that will happen, but those are definitely those protocols and those teachings that go along with it are just things that those are things that you can't really learn off of social media or reading a book. Those are things that you learn from those that grew up with that knowledge. So for me, I try to learn these things to preserve it and to have that knowledge there. But at the same time, that doesn't mean you just go out and start harvesting all kinds of stuff and doing different things with them. You have to, take your time and be patient with it. And when the time's right, I believe that these things will come to you and, you'll be able to use it in a good way.
Mm. Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. I think that type of mentality and philosophy can probably be applied to other areas when you think about it. Like, I think there's a need for a lot of people to want to have like some of the buzzwords in our culture, like star knowledge, all this stuff, right? And there are certain things that probably were in the common person domain. And then there was also like Wapia Wichashta, or different people that were gifted those things, and maybe it was just for them to know, and to share those types of things. And so yesterday at our Tatanka Omnichia, our Buffalo Roundtable meeting, we talked about a lot of different things, and it was a really good event. We got to share a little bit about the Fort Peck tribal buffalo herd, cultural herd, business herd, a lot of different things, man. But like, I think there's certain things that hopefully podcasts like this, we could only touch on it a little bit, but I think it's good to plant these seeds in people's minds that our, I guess, our philosophy and thought process is hopefully to start having people start thinking more about our Okoda Kichie. That's my, I guess that's my hope, even with myself, is to start establishing more traditional, um, I guess, governance type system. I guess maybe that's the type of word, but like our societies or groups of people that have different roles and responsibilities, and they're able to kind of share this within a group. And I think that's a natural thing. That's more intuitive. It's a natural way of learning. It's a natural style of socialization, and I think transmission of knowledge. And so naturally things are going to look a little different. I remember talking with you and another Tanshi a while back this summer that our culture does change to a degree, evolves a little bit, but certain things don't. Right? We might use different mechanisms and tools, but I think keeping that in mind, just like our artwork, our winter counts aren't necessarily meant to look exactly the same. Our artwork, it'll evolve and change, but I think the elders of long ago probably would like to see us evolve into a more modern world. And so I think hopefully with that type of thought process, we're able to preserve philosophy and teachings in a new way. And hopefully that's just kind of my thoughts on that. But I know during this meeting there was some good things shared, and we talked a little bit about like the containment area where the buffalo is at, and these are they're conversations that need to be had as far as like if there are medicines that grow within this containment area, we have to be cognizant and think about what we're doing when we open things up to the public. If we want to facilitate being caretakers of buffalo, and that really is a thing, then we need to be respectful that we're not unintentionally devastating the ecosystems that will promote health and wellness for this buffalo. So those two things are related. I always thought it was like ironic, the plight of Indian people in the buffalo, the herds. They've kind of dwindled down in size. There's a whole backstory to that one that was probably done on purpose and whatnot. But like we find ourselves, you know, um, being revitalizing language, culture. Our nations are growing, so which coincides with buffalo. And so the things that are on my mind when we have these types of meetings, I'm sure every tribal community has a similar, they're all different views, but we share a common collective interest in maintaining health with the buffalo, and everyone might have different teachings with that and community understanding. But I really am super interested in like the grasslands, the ecology around buffalo, because we don't want to just treat them like cattle. That was on my mind yesterday, and the only reason I bring this stuff up because I think anybody that happens to listen to this and it increases my own learning is let's keep that forefront on what that looks like, because one, we know that the grasslands have changed through farming and whatnot, and they're probably supposed to change to a degree with the cycles of just the land itself. But we don't want to treat our buffalo like cattle. We don't want to just ignore those things. And so I'm hoping down the road as we continue to learn and share information that we have a better understanding of buffalo health. And when anyone that gets out there to look at a buffalo herd, I think next to maybe Yellowstone, Fort Peck herd is probably one of the larger ones that are genetically pure, I guess you would say. but to me, it's like a life-changing thing to observe buffalo, to observe them in a natural herd setting. We learn from them. And I was really like happy to hear people share things yesterday. And hopefully we get more turnout for those types of things in the future. But Tahashi, what did you think about, I guess, anything I was talking about? Maybe the meeting, but like even when we're talking about harvesting plants, I know our buffalo, they're different, than cattle. The way that they selectively eat foods and medicines because I think they're just more in tune with the land. And so, what do you think about that? How can we better support that with that type of thinking in mind?
Yeah, I think the one of the key things I was thinking as you're talking is that like we we don't live in the 1800s anymore, and everything has drastically changed for us, whether it's the land, whether it's the our diet, what happened to the buffalo and other animals, and our language, all of these things, right? They were, attacked, honestly. But so I always have this kind of philosophy or this viewpoint that like we should learn as much as we can about how things were, how our people operated, how they did things pre-contact, post-contact, all of that, the deep knowledge that our people carried, whether it's about the stars, whether it's stories, whether it's how they interacted with the land and animals, hunted, whatever it is, the spiritual, the ceremonies, the philosophies, learn that as a foundation, but then we cannot restrict ourselves to that. You can only do things one way. And the reason why is because so much has happened. So when we talk about kinship laws, we talk about how we were with our in-laws or different things like that. And an example of this is, I might go off a little bit, but it's all relevant. Um, my wife Laverne, right? I remember her uncle was talking about her grandma Mary Nor that raised her great grandma that raised her, and I believe she was the daughter-in-law to Red Dog. And Red Dog told her one time, because in our culture, right, you don't talk to your father-in-law, son-in-law doesn't talk to his mother-in-law. But Red Dog had told her this. I know that this goes against our customs, but I have things to share with you. I have things to tell you so that these things don't die and go away. So he had to make an adjustment to the time that they were living in. And there's a lot of examples that we could give that show this, because we live in different times and we have to stay with the times. And that doesn't mean that we get lost in what society is surrounding us with. It's that if your families are broken, if our land is broken, if our language is broken, if these things are happening, we have to find ways to strengthen and bring these things back. And it may not be the ideal way that it was a long time ago. We know our fluent speakers grew up in homes surrounded by the language, hearing the language day in and day out. I had this conversation last week in my oral traditions class. And I allow the students, like, give me your feedback, tell me your thoughts. And so one of them was like, I don't believe in recording songs, stories, language. Like that's not the way it's supposed to be done. And I respect that ideology, because I believe ideally that we shouldn't either. But how are we going to learn these things if we don't? Because we're not being raised in a home with fluent speakers. We do this language work for a living. We surround ourselves with it. We create the atmosphere to hear the language all the time, and we still hardly ever hear it because it's just not there. And so that's how I learned. I would record when Kushi would tell a story. And thank God I did, because how would I remember a story that she told me if I only heard it once or twice? How would I be able to retell that story verbatim? And at the same time, if she's telling me that story in Dakota and I don't even fluently comprehend what she is saying. So by recording that, I was able to listen to it over and over and over again. And those stories can now continue to live on because I can share that. Because now, these years later, I fluently comprehend what she was telling me, where back then I didn't. And Wana Edushni, she's not here no more. So I can't go to her to reference these things or ask. So that's an example of how we may have to adjust, how we have to, come to terms with the reality of the world that we live in today. And always keeping in mind for my grandchildren that, okay, now I can hopefully go back to telling them these things orally and telling it to them enough to where then it becomes a part of them. They don't have to record me. They don't have to go to those extremes anymore. So I think the same thing when it comes to the ecology of the land. When your land has been decimated by agriculture, by development, by pollution, by all of these things, how do we rebuild that? And one person said, you just leave it alone and let the earth take care of it and it'll take care of itself. There's some truth to that, but at the same time, like, no, because we can see it on the prairie. When you allow the prairie to be left alone, even if it's never been molested or disturbed, it's never been plowed or anything, invasive species still will take over that land. Our people were very intentional. The prairie wasn't just something that miraculously appeared through time and creation. Our people actually had a hand in developing that prairie, that ecosystem. And that was through fire. It was through their hunting methods. It was through the buffalo. It was through all of these different things that had created the prairie. Now our prairie it's either turning into a cornfield or it's turning into woodlands because our people are not on the land taking care of it. And so now we see in our communities where certain areas get decimated by fire year after year, but there are things that we could be out there doing to lessen the impact of that. There are things that not only will this help us to retain our cultural connection with our plants and animals, all of these things, but I believe it's something that will help us to combat climate change also.
It had me thinking a couple different things. One was I every week there's a few fluent speakers. I try to, because I'm a language learner too, and I try to utilize technology to just to, if anything, so I don't regress, but ideally, so I keep learning language from speakers and whatnot. But one of the questions I've kind of grappled with over the years was, so with stories, because of a lot of our stories, when we start talking about language, it connects to stories. And then a lot of that has to do with the land, obviously. And so like one of them is ohunkaka or ohunkake. So like there used to be rules, I guess, wo'ope that was like, I guess, attached to times of the year you were supposed to like share when it was just winter, when snow was on the ground. And I had heard from Nakota way that one of the rules, I guess, back Ehana was that one of the rules for telling a story out of season was that the storyteller that committed this infraction, I guess, would get lost. And then back in those days, to be lost was almost like a death sentence, right? To be separated from the community if you were out traveling. So, but those are stories, and they were in place for a reason. But I teach a couple introductory Dakota language classes the past few years, and so I'm learning. So I'm always fielding questions from students about things, and I do my best to reference fluent speakers and share what I think is happening. But one of those questions, like, was when can we share some of these stories? And in my mind, is like, what qualifies as ohunkaka? Is it just the myths, creation stories? We have so many stories, unkto stories. And so I had a hard time believing that our people never told stories only in wintertime. I'm sure there was ones that were shared other times of the year, but I posed that question to one of our speakers that I work with. And this is just one speaker, they don't speak on behalf of all fluent speakers, but I try and like keep these perspectives in mind, was that in this individual's speaker's perspectives, that we live in the time of Waniatu, is that, and it makes you think, like he said, not just, so alluding to the fact that not just this time of right now for this one, this year right now of this time of year, but like this age, it's like an age, like the past post reservation era, definitely the past 30, 40 years. In his mind, the way he thinks, you live in the time of Waniatu, where we basically we almost have to share things out of the traditional storytelling season in order to preserve storytelling for our children because we don't have much time left, especially elders. So I'm not saying that that's true, right, or whatever, but I think that's just something for people to think about. Is there's not a lot of time with fluent speakers, and I think doing things to record things, or I'm not telling people to tell ohunkake stories out of season, but just something to think about, Tahanshi. And I grapple with some of those things as well. But the other thing when you were talking about was how the earth's changed. I definitely it's applicable here in Fort Peck. Is Benicio Shea, this river, it was dammed up. I don't know, back in the 20s, 30s, or whatever. And so it disturbed the ecology of the entire ecosystem from where it was dammed all the way down to the Mississippi River, the confluence. And there's probably several dam structures in place, but what you'd notice is that there's an right along the natural flow path of the Missouri here, all along it, we're seeing a devastation to cottonwood trees. And what you're seeing is an influx of ash. And so cotton would require and Wakachinja the other they're poplar trees. Cottonwoods and they need that a lot of I guess spring runoff. They require a lot of water. And so a lot of those old trees they're dying, man. Those are ones that were here since for over 100 years. Same thing along the Poplar River that was dammed up farther as well. And so there's just a lot of old trees and a lot of these ash are coming through. And so those are the types of effects, that have an impact on what we're doing. And so to ignore those things, I think something to think about. I've often wondered why don't we like initiate like planting some of these trees back? And maybe it's supposed to like I don't know, man. Like I'm not trained scientifically in botany and all this stuff, but it makes sense if you want to like maintain the integrity and maybe I don't know if they'll ever get rid of the dams, right? But how can we, to a degree, reintroduce natural floods to come in? So many people now live in flood zones and all this. I don't know what the answer is, but that's definitely something to think about. Dokri Dukcha.
Yeah, I think that like a interesting thing that was brought up in the conversation yesterday was, talking about science, right? Research, all of this stuff. And you will hear people say this all the time from, like a Dakota perspective that, like looking at science as a negative thing, right? But in reality, as Dakota people, our people were scientists in the truest sense. They were. It was different than Western science, just like education, right? Like there's a difference between Dakota education and Western education. So I think that in today's world, how do we have a solid foundation of a Dakota way of thinking about things, but then taking the good stuff from modern science that can help us in that, so as long as you're grounded in understanding our way of life, our ceremonies, our spirituality, and our intimate relationship with the land, because those things have changed because we no longer live off of the land. We may be connected to the land and we may have activities that we do with the land, but I know so many of our people, their exposure to the land, like they may participate in certain ceremonies or whatever, and they'll go out and harvest this or harvest that, and then that may be the extent of it. They're not relying on the hunting and to feed themselves. If they do hunt, a lot of time it's for sport, or whatever it may be. So we have to keep that in mind, that what did it look like a long time ago when our people, this was everything to them. This was their way of life and the intimate knowledge that they had of these things. And then how do you balance that with the science, that because we can sit there and talk about things, but that doesn't solve nothing. We have to put into action all of these things. And so myself, like I'm at a point in my life where I have to learn and I have to look outside of just what in our Dakota world, all these things that I've learned from these elders over the years, which I cherish that knowledge. I hold it dearly. But then I've also learned recently that I can reach out and I can start looking at other Western scientific things that talk about birds and their migration or whatever, learning that there's, different types of nests that different birds have, like just things like that. And so using that, and the thing that I see today that gives me hope is a lot of young Native people that are becoming scientists. And they're grounded in that, their cultural identity, but they're not afraid to venture into those institutions to learn that stuff. So as long as we're doing it in the right way and we, have an understanding of our Dakota philosophies with that, we can do a lot with that information. But we have to put it into action, and it has to become at the forefront of everything that we're doing today. Because I tell people this, to me, climate change is a serious thing. I just was on the phone with my daughter who's in the army and lives down in Georgia, and they got hit with snowstorm. And she goes, and everybody's here freaking out. They're losing power. All of this stuff is going on. Everything's shutting down because it never snows in Georgia. The fires that just happened in LA, like this is proof. Like there's things changing, and our people have always talked about this stuff. We know it to be real. So how are we going to adapt and move along with these things that we're dealing with? Alaska is a prime example. The Inupiaq people and all of them up there that have been dealing with this because they still live that way. They survive off of the land, and so they, instead of freaking out about it, they say, we have always adjusted, we have always adapted, because the ecosystems have always changed since the beginning of time, and we have stories about those things. So we're in that time where we cannot have our head in the sand. We have to be proactive. We have to be, learning, teaching, and working all at once today to make sure that our future generations are still going to have a place to live. Because relearning our language, relearning our culture, all of these things, they mean nothing if we don't have a planet to live on. But by learning those things, they're connected to the stuff we're going to find the answers to be able to solve our problems that we're faced with today. But we have to be aware of them.
I know I think that's a good spot to wrap it up for this episode, I guess you would say. And then maybe next time we could talk a little bit more about because I think climate change is one of those things that doesn't go away. And I think I think we all have something to contribute, different things. Whether that's some of us might lean more scientifically or different things, but I think we all have a stake in this. And I think there's a lot of different, like, even at the small scale, uh, I think the term is regenerative farming, things like that. Maybe we could talk about that a little bit more next time, but we'll wrap it up for now. Duksta.